Before we get to this week's episode of Dispatches from Planet Albany, I want to mention that we're brought to you with support from New York State United Teachers and National Fuel. To find out how your special interests can reach my coveted audience, email david.lombardo@wcny.org. And if you want to dig into your own pockets, check out capitalpressroom.org/donate. And one programming note, this is part one of a two-part episode, with the second episode dropping in a few days.
I've also declared war on potholes, so here's the first shot across the bow.
Well, as you know, with Planet Albany, there's always something that makes the planet turn.
And it's this amazing view of D.C., and Eddie Vedder comes out. And he goes, "You have a cigarette?" And I've never smoked in my life, but if I had, I wish that was the moment.
And this strategy takes us from potholes to knotholes.
I would like to say it was a pleasure, Mr. Kim. But I'm on the road.
I'm David Lombardo, and this is Dispatches from Planet Albany, a WCNY podcast about power and politics in state government. And this week, we're exploring the longshot gubernatorial candidacy of Lieutenant Governor Antonio Delgado. And our guest is Rebecca Garrrard, the interim co-executive director of Citizen Action of New York, a liberal advocacy group that appears to be fostering the embers of this nascent intra-party challenge to Governor Hochul. Welcome back to the show, Rebecca.
What an introduction. Thank you for having me. It's been too long, my friend, too long.
Well, we're glad to have you back. And since it's been such a while, I want to touch on one other item that happened since you and I last talked officially. And it's just something that tickled me pink, and I have to imagine you're interested in it too. And that is State Senator Jessica Ramos endorsing the mayoral candidacy of Andrew Cuomo. At the time, I was like, this is coming out of left field, given the fact that she was once described as a pair of fucking idiots by the governor's spokesperson. She is ideologically opposed to him, has spoken out against him the whole time of his in the executive mansion. But then, upon deeper reflection, I thought of her as a candidate who had been basically spurned by the WFP, is in a train heading nowhere in terms of her mayoral bid, and I'm like, okay, this makes more sense. She sees, some sort of life after the state senate for herself. What did you make of this endorsement?
I will say what I made of it, and it's very reflective of the conversation I had with her. Uh-huh. Running for office is not an easy thing, and it is a sacrifice that I certainly will never sign up for. So I respect those that do and have a lot of grace for decision-making that I can't be a part of. Look, the reality is Jessica Ramos has been a champion for progressive things through pretty much the entirety of her career, right?
So it makes sense that she's allying with progressive Andrew Cuomo.
And this clearly was a choice that was out of line with that. And I don't think, my guess would be right, is not related to policy alignment.
No, it's Machiavellian, isn't it?
I think Machiavellian is going too far, right? No. I would imagine that as a candidate, people make choices all the time. And I think I see it all the time where self-preservation, self-interest, and...
In politicians?
Can you imagine such a thing? Needs to come into play. I will say that I think often we are harder on female elected officials when they make these choices.
Tough but fair.
Than we are on male elected officials who quite often hold two dual sort of stances, straddle the line, and receive less scrutiny. In the interest of full disclosure, today a press release went out announcing that Citizen Action withdrew Senator Ramos's endorsement from our mayoral slate. We have endorsed...
She goes from 1% to...
Michael Blake. I'm sure that will be the deal breaker in this race. I mean, it's the coveted endorsement, let's be clear.
Well, we're going to talk a little bit about the importance of Citizen Action of New York in politics in general. And why don't we just get to the reason you're here then, which is the candidacy of Antonio Delgado for governor. And I want to start with the question that I think we need to start with, which is Citizen Action of New York going to endorse the gubernatorial campaign of Delgado? Because if I look at the tea leaves that are out there, the partnerships that have already been publicly in the works, and the way you guys have stood by him even after he's announced his campaign, and while most other players are scurrying and hiding or coming out in favor of Hochul, you guys are still arm in arm with him. So you want to make an endorsement right now?
I wish I could give you such a scoop, but the reality is that the process for citizen action is membership-led, and so we have not gone through that process.
Is that a membership that you think would be inclined to support Kathy Hochul if they had any other options at all?
I think our membership has been extremely clear that they are not happy and feel deeply frustrated with the decision-making and leadership that we've seen in Governor Hochul.
Mm-hmm. So does that mean you guys will endorse anyone in the Democratic slate that is not Kathy Hochul?
That does not mean that. That is absolutely does not mean that. So while our membership base clearly is unhappy with the path that Governor Hochul has chosen, both in terms of the policies she's chosen and in terms of the alignment with special interests and PACs, our membership is not looking to sub her out for another problem. Our membership is looking for a candidate for governor who is going to fight for the things that they care about, who's going to be accountable to constituents and not special interests, who's going to create a New York that works for the many and not the privileged few.
For the many. So, good tie-in there. For
the many and the masses.
So let's talk about the idea of a Delgado candidacy, because from my perspective, there are two ways this could go for him. And I see the 2025 mayoral campaign of Zellner Myrie, which took off like, I don't know, what's a bird that can't fly? Because that's pretty much it. Had all the promise of a exciting New York Times launch in 2024, never materialized. Conversely, there's the presidential run that was successful of Barack Obama, who kind of came out of nowhere, took on the unpopular establishment figure in Hillary Clinton, and ultimately was successful. There's probably some limits to my thinking in that I'm only talking about black men here, but I think they're kind of fair comparisons. So from your perspective, how does Delgado avoid being Zellner Myrie and becomes Barack Obama, so to speak?
Yeah, I mean, I think for Delgado to do well and accomplish what he wants to accomplish, I think Antonio Delgado needs to be Antonio Delgado, right? And that is the person who was elected to Congress in a Republican-held district that is...
in a huge swing year for Democrats.
Correct.
Which 2026 could be as well. But
correct.
That's not
correct. But he was also a black man running in an extraordinarily white rural
90%
district.
White, as he likes to remind people.
I mean, here, let me also remind you and the listeners. He needs to be him. And the him that he is, if I were advising him, which I'm not, is...
Are you having any conversations with him at these events where Citizen Action is with Antonio Delgado?
I mean, certainly we've been doing some partnership before he launched. Through his role as lieutenant governor. And so have he and I spoken, and have I been involved in those partnerships? Absolutely.
Anything on the political side?
I am always curious about what his thoughts or any other candidate's thoughts are.
But have you had those conversations?
We have absolutely had conversations about where does he think New York is going. And I can listen like any other outsider to his speeches that he gives to get a feel for where he thinks New York is going. And so... to wrap up the last question, he only needs to be himself, and that I think he has a very unique ability to communicate with a wide demographic, geography of New York voters and connect with them.
Yeah, he seems to have this ability to be kind of a mirror to people. You kind of can assign your hopes and dreams to him, regardless of whether you're to the left of Kathy Hochul or maybe even to the right of Kathy Hochul. And I wonder whether you see that as a plus or whether that speaks to someone who maybe doesn't necessarily have a clear ideology.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would assert that he's not a mirror. What he's actually holding and representing is what the vast majority of New York voters have wanted to see in a candidate and haven't been able to in some time. And so given that absence, that gap, right? Maybe it feels like a mirror, but I think, look, we only have to look at the elections in terms of Trump, in terms of this really huge swing towards Zohran. And we could name, to your point, right? Let's not go into 1,000 examples, but for 10, 20, 15 years, the electorate has clearly been crying out for something different, really since Obama, right? Saying we don't want the establishment. And so anybody who's willing to give that message, honestly, on either end of the ideological spectrum has been very successful. And Antonio Delgado is talking that language. It very much comes across as something he believes and breathes. And New York voters are really hungry for that.
A lot to unpack there. And I want to start with this idea of people receiving that message, because this is hyperbole, but nobody knows who Antonio Delgado is. And I'm curious how you think he's going to actually get that message to people in a meaningful way if, one, he's unable to raise the funds to launch a massive paid media campaign, and, two, whether there's just not that much interest in him after a while if his campaign doesn't really take off.
To your first point, this is a reality of New York politics, especially when we're talking about a race as high profile as a gubernatorial race. There has to be a certain threshold of dollars for it to be viable.
Yeah,
right?
What would you want to see in his July filing?
I'm not sure about the July filing, but I can say that I think for this to be the race that he would want it to be, we should be talking about at least a total of $15 million.
Yeah. And where does that come from in a state where people are pretty transactional with their donations, and most people are going to stick with the establishment if you're a big in-state donor who wants to do business in New York State? So where does he get money from?
I think he has a lot of connections to people who are interested in seeing change. I think
not big money elites, though, right?
No. Well, look, let's say
God forbid,
this.
Right?
God forbid,
Oh,
right? God forbid.
I feel dirty. I'm going to need a shower after this.
I mean, we have public campaign financing in the gubernatorial race for the first time. If he maxes out on small donations, that's about $3.5 million right there. That is part of the reason that we have been fighting for this for so long, is that's a game changer. Is it the 15 million threshold I named? Absolutely not. But it is a game changer. In our last gubernatorial challenge to the sitting governor, the total raised was well under $1 million for the entirety of that campaign.
Not to speak ill of the left candidate in that race, though, he was not exactly running a energetic campaign. I mean, he had a lot on his plate, Jumaane Williams at the time.
100%. I'm just saying, had there been a small donor matching, that race, even given his justifiably limited capacity, would have looked very different, right? If you could have injected $3.5 million in public campaign financing into that.
Yeah.
And I don't think it meets the threshold we need. Governor Hochul is an extremely skilled and gifted fundraiser. And so there has to be that higher amount. I think a huge strategic, planned out, statewide small donor program has to exist that goes well beyond just meeting the $3.5 million threshold. And I think, although he has pledged to not take, corporate PAC contributions.
Bless his heart.
We love to see it. I think it will be important for some individual donors to weigh in. His career, even pre-congressional race in Washington, certainly I would hope would bear some relationships of people who have some money to throw at what they think is a societal problem.
And what about that second part, that idea of earned media? Because this is someone who at times is willing to engage with the media, at times is more reclusive than J.D. Salinger. So how do you find him, to actually get out there on the hustings, so to speak, and take advantage of earned media? Because we'd love to have you on the show, AD. We'd love to have you here, but to no avail.
I have not found him to be Salinger-esque.
No.
Perhaps I'm just lucky. My guess is he will be happy to return, but who am I to say? Maybe
not after this.
Maybe you rubbed him the wrong way. I'm not sure.
We've definitely had
done?
a conversation. I can't remember this when he was a member of Congress or early in his time as LG, but I I think it was in Congress, and we were talking about some farming bill, and he was unhappy with me. And I could tell in our most recent interview, he was getting annoyed with my persistent questioning, and we're going to talk about his interactions with the media. But what do you think his media strategy should be right now?
I think he needs to get himself, if I were involved in his campaign, I think it would be important to get...
If's doing a lot of work there.
It's real.
Okay.
Getting yourself out there is important, right? Name recognition is, as a candidate, his biggest challenge right now. Period. End of story. Anytime he is able to get out there, from what I've seen, his message resonates. He wins people over. And so part of the reason that level of money, the main part of the reason that level of money is necessary is there is a window to expose his message, his brand, his platform, his vision to New York voters so that they can make an informed choice. And that has to include being willing at some point, if not now, to do the media tour and to do it often and repeatedly.
Need help keeping track of the legislative session? Wish you had an extra set of eyes at the Capitol? New York State Watch does all of that and more. Discover New York State's premier legislative intelligence service by visiting nystatewatch.net. I was watching his interview on Inside City Hall with Errol Lewis, and I liked how they put up some of his positions on the screen, made it very helpful in terms of...
We all love a visual.
Yeah, in terms of understanding where he stands. And the thing that stood out to me is how he's leaning into this idea of taxing the rich. And that's something he even acknowledged when we had him on in the spring, and he tried to focus more on corporations. I wanted to hear about individuals, but he's clearly interested in this idea of paying the fair share, to use the lingo that was up there. That polls really well.
It polls so well.
And this governor has shown no interest in doing that. How far can he go on that issue? Because I think a lot of the other ones, despite what you might think, are not going to be ones that move the needle. If you want to talk about building housing, I don't think it's that big of a mover and shaker in elections. If you talk about raising the minimum wage, I think the governor can point to her own accomplishments on that. So taxing the rich, what does that look like as a winning strategy, and how far can it go?
I think it could take any candidate extremely far. And I often wonder why it's not, I think we know why, right? It is not a strategy that is employed as frequently as I would like to see. And I think we know the reason for that is when it's not, it's because we have special interest donors who are pulling strings behind the scenes to ensure that doesn't happen.
But not Delgado's donors, other donors.
I don't think we have wealthy special interest donors who are playing behind the scenes there. If he certainly pivots away from taxing the rich, I will be the first one asking questions as to what was the onus for that.
Gotcha.
You have my promise on that. But to your point, there are two things that poll almost universally well across party lines. It's that one, which makes me happy, and one that makes me very unhappy, which is more police. Public safety is through the lens of incarceration and cops, right?
So, and luckily, Delgado was supportive of the 2022 efforts to expand the use of cash bail. So he's going to be on the right side of both issues.
Right. So my point is, this is an enormously popular issue. I think it is a unifying issue when we think about not just the Democratic Party, but if he were to win a primary, what will be a general, right? Where he'll have to go against what seems to be at this point, right, a Republican who has a ton of name recognition and who will have all the resources anybody could possibly want.
And you're referring to Bethany Supervisor Carl Hyde Jr.?
Yes, her, or Stefanik. Either one
Carl
of
Hyde
those.
Jr. is a gentleman. But
or him, yes. Or, yes,
but
Stefanik.
town of Bethany.
Oh, Town of Bethany,
Yes.
got it. Much apologies to him. Much apologies.
He's a big fan, too. So, Carl,
I bet.
our apology.
Yeah, Carl, I'm so sorry.
This is your camera, by the way.
Oh, hi, Carl. My bad. Yes, I'm referring to Representative Stefanik.
Gotcha.
So it's unifying in both of those contexts, right? It speaks to and addresses the spending side of what really hits home and personalizes things for all voters, right? We need resources to address what are likely to be gaps in Medicaid and Medicare. We need resources to address childhood poverty, which in New York is unexcusably off the charts.
And he's been talking about that in that Errol Lewis interview. He talked about child poverty, but do people care about that issue? Does it actually move primary voters?
I think...
Let me rephrase that. I don't think it does.
Yeah.
Statement.
I think primary voters are moved by a message that says the government's purpose is to serve the masses. Mm-hmm. And in order to do that, it needs resources, and it's perfectly reasonable to say that those resources should come from everyone and be proportional to those who can afford to give more. Mm-hmm. Voters are not unaware that in the last, not just since the pandemic, but in the last few decades, that the wealth inequality has just skyrocketed. And even if they don't know the statistics, they feel it. Even if you're not well versed on the stats, it's felt in the bones of almost everyone. And so when you have someone who says government's job is to pool resources from those who can afford to give it and redistribute it to those who need it, and so that everyone can have an experience as a New Yorker that is at a bare minimum dignified and livable, I think that moves voters. I 100% absolutely do.
We're having this conversation against the backdrop of a primary in New York City that we mentioned at the top, and it seems to me like if Antonio Delgado wants to be successful, he needs to do very well in New York City, in addition to around the state. And to me, it seems like he needs to build on, if not capture, the momentum that Zohran Mamdani's campaign has done. And I'm curious how you think he does that, given that he is a different political persona than Zohran. He is not as good, from my perspective, as a public speaker as the assembly member, and he might have different priorities than the assembly member. But he clearly needs those people and that energy. So how does he capitalize on that?
Zohran's campaign is an example of what we know from Obama's campaign, too, from, again, insert any grassroots.
You say insert any, but that's a pretty special calculus. I wonder how replicable it actually is.
True. And I think we know that if you have an effective grassroots outreach, strategy, field plan, execution, that is a winning strategy to move voters. Governor Hochul had all the funds in the world for her last election cycle. And I would assert was absent a grassroots field plan. It was very media-based.
And she still got 2/3 of the vote in the primary.
My point was going to be she won against a Trump Republican by single digits.
Sure.
A Trump Republican lost to her.
That's tomorrow's problem, though. You're talking about the general.
I think if the Democratic Party, no matter who we're talking about, is not taking seriously that we need to have a strategy through the general, then I don't actually know what we're thinking about.
Is that the pitch that Delgado is a better top-of-the-ticket candidate than Hochul, given the experience in 2022 where New York did very poorly in its congressional seats? Are you saying that Delgado could actually drag people across the finish line in, say, marginal House districts in New York?
I think it's one of the important things that we have to name.
Wait, weren't we talking about Zohran momentum, though? Weren't we still talking about how to capture that?
And so the answer to that was a real grassroots campaign. Zohran has run a brilliant grassroots campaign. Obama ran a brilliant grassroots campaign. Zohran also has, obviously, a special sauce around social media that I don't want to dismiss or invisibilize. But I think...
Invisibilize? Man, I am not in these woke streets the way you are. That is an interesting new term to me. I've never heard it.
Oh.
Maybe it's a Gen Z thing.
Look at me in my kids. Look at me in my old age leading the young woke
You have young
movements.
kids though, so they
I must
probably
be picking it up from them because I'm sure it's not in my peer group. Let's be clear.
Okay. In 2018, Cuomo got 65% of the primary vote against Cynthia Nixon, and I think that's important to bring up because that was a midterm year where there was Democratic enthusiasm. I should say there was a split primary then in June and September, but the IDC members, 6 or 7 of them got knocked out, 6 out of 8, yep. And none of that, though, translated at the statewide level. should we think of the statewide campaign as being immune to those sort of localized trends, or is there a way to convert that Democratic enthusiasm to the top of the ticket?
I mean, I think we'll see, right? I think there's a path. Mm-hmm. Is 2026 the year where it actualizes? I think we'll see.
Okay.
I think we'll see.
Delgado's ideological lane, how does he avoid being pilloried as the leftist candidate? Because there are people who might be not in love with Kathy Hochul. Maybe it's the Tom Suozzi voter of 2022, but isn't willing to go to her left. Is that a problem that you foresee? Because you need all voters.
His congressional race that he won was not in a leftist district.
No. Purple.
Very purple. And very white and very rural, I'll say for the second time. Maybe I'll just tattoo it on my forehead. And so when we're thinking about being able to hold that duality of being to the left of Kathy but not being too left, he has a track record as a candidate of being able to sort of hold that lane. Mm-hmm. You know, we have a lot of time. His career and his decision-making and his votes do not provide huge pitfalls that I can see in terms of being portrayed as too leftist and making him unappealing to a broad set of voters. Mm.
You said we have a lot of time, and I think about how he's used his time over the last 6 months, because in the wake of the general election, he had what seemed like the start of a media rollout, had his op-ed, appeared on MSNBC, and then kind of nothing until he was calling on Eric Adams to step down, and then again, brief media blitz, back into the shadows. I don't know whether he and J.D. Salinger had a book club together or what, but regardless, what do you think of the way he spent his last 6 months? Because some might say it's been a missed opportunity in terms of getting some momentum going. I mean, you say there's a lot of time left, but he's got to run a marathon, so maybe you'd want a bit of a head start.
I think he just launched his campaign. And so the 6 months before that, I would hope and I would imagine.
You say hope. What do you know that he was up to over the last 6 months?
I would hope and I would imagine would be spent doing relationship building and setting a foundation for a campaign that you know is going to be launched. And I think there is logic in that, as that is probably best not done in the public eye, simultaneous to your launching a campaign. I'm not going to sit here and say that every step of the rollout of his since that New York Times article, if I were someone who was advising the campaign, matches exactly what I would have done, because that's not the case. But where it matters, which is when he is in a public-facing place, what is he saying? Who is he saying it to? I think has gone well. And I think from this point moving forward, it's going to be really interesting to see who is he going to bring with him? How is he going to be able to get out there in a very necessary way across the state, in every corner of the state? And how is his fundraising going to go?
Well, moving forward, do you think it's a big advantage to his campaign that he doesn't have anything to do as LG, and so he can travel New York on the state's dime as a de facto campaigner?
As someone who's just been peripherally watching this in the news, like anyone else would, it seems to me that he has been disinvited from participating in his role in LG. Mm-hmm. And so I would guess, given that he is no longer welcome to participate in the highest levels of our state government, he is making the best use of his time by
de facto campaigning,
by trying to make a difference in what the future of our state looks like.
And speaking about his time as LG then more broadly, how does he respond to the fact that based on his public schedule, which the governor's office was very happy to give me a couple of weeks ago, once he was clearly on the outs with them, something that I don't know whether they'd be so quick to hand over back in 2024. Putting that aside, though, how does he address this? The fact that he was kind of a stay-at-home dad for the first 2 years of his time as LG and seemed to work his schedule around raising young kids. So how does he talk about that? Because it's going to come up more and more and more once this campaign really ratchets up.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a valid question. My guess is there's a couple of answers to that. One is that his participation was not always welcome, encouraged, or assigned. Mm-hmm. Look, the role of LG is not one where you have a lot of autonomy, authority to set your own agenda. For her to point a finger in his lack of participation is to perhaps be disingenuous in how much of a role she played in that.
He was fine, though, with it for 3+ years.
And I just don't remember seeing Kathy Hochul out and about all up in my business when she was LG before Cuomo.
Are you kidding?
She
was
kidding. Constantly
at ribbon cuttings, constantly running the REDCs and making the trips around the hustings.
So I don't have this, so I could totally be wrong. But my guess is if you polled New Yorkers on name recognition of LG when she was LG, it would have been very comparable.
Sure.
So just because she was at press appearances that were defined by Cuomo, and that same schedule was not defined by her for her LG, is nothing I think she deserves credit for or he deserves derision for.
Anything that Delgado has to answer for from your perspective and to the people of your ilk as it comes to
my flock.
His 2022 decision to not run for Congress, to not potentially square off against Mark Molinaro and instead find the safety and comfort in the Hochul administration?
I can't speak for the masses.
Well, speak for Rebecca Garrrard, co-executive director in an interim capacity of Citizen Action
I
New
will
York.
speak for Rebecca Garrrard with my Citizen Action hat off.
Okay.
As a political junkie.
And how disappointed you were in him?
And that didn't bother me.
No?
That didn't bother me. I
conceded a seat to Mark Molinaro?
It didn't bother me.
Potentially helped hand over the majority to the Republicans?
I'm going to say it again. That didn't bother me.
Okay.
I think if there's anything I've heard conversations about, it's some of his voting record being too moderate when he was in Congress. And so to your point about are people going to think he's too left, I think the left is going to embrace him. And if anything, that's more of a thing I think he's going to have to answer questions about.
And that was part one of our two-part examination of the path, if there is one, to the executive mansion for Antonio Delgado. Keep an eye out and ear open for the second part dropping into your podcast feed soon. Until then, podcast adjourned.
Oh, sorry. Okay, go.
I already got it.